And now for the latest on the Iran conflict and what China's role has been, joining us now to discuss is Victoria Churchill, U.S. political reporter for the Daily Mail. So Victoria, so good to have you here. Good afternoon to you. So as you heard from our reporter just now, Iran has agreed for nuclear inspections inside of the country. I mean, we'll still have to wait and see what comes out of this. But initially speaking, I mean, is this a positive step in the right direction, potentially suggesting partial cooperation?
Well, absolutely. And I think it's welcome for the American people to hear that Iran is willing to change their tune, at least based on the latest reports that we're seeing. You know, I think this has been a priority of President Trump and the Trump administration for really over a year now, right? Since we saw the first strikes in Iran last summer. You know, I primarily cover Capitol Hill, where we heard from a bunch of lawmakers, particularly on the Republican side, that they thought that those strikes were needed if that was to push Iran's nuclear program back, you know, for years, if not decades. And, you know, of course, we saw the renewed engagement in Iran earlier this year, which meant that the U.S. did not finish their business that they went to Iran for last year. And so I think that the American people really do want to see this conflict resolved sooner rather than later. You know, lawmakers, particularly in swing districts, for most of them, this is a key issue that their voters care about as they're headed to the polls. And I think the longer that Republican lawmakers have to justify their support for the war, because they're backing the president's agenda, the harder it is going to be for them to win those voters over at the polls that are skeptical about this war.
So you mentioned maybe Iran is changing their tune. Do you think prior to this operation or the most recent happenings and actions by the U.S. in Iran, prior to that, do you think the Iranian regime, let's say the first tier or the second tier, would have agreed to U.S. terms, including having people go inside to inspect their nuclear program?
No, I don't think so.
Why do you think it's because of the military pressure, more so on that, or the diplomatic pressure, or maybe a mixture of both?
I think it's both. I mean, obviously, we know the old, I believe it was the Roosevelt adage, you know, the walk softly and carry a big stick. The U.S. has not been walking softly. They have shown their big stick in this case. And so for them, you know, they want to see that the people that they have in power, I think they want to stay in power because for a lot of them, you know, this is some of their closest allies who they've, you know, come up for the ranks with, whether that's the IRGC or within government, which, you know, of course have plenty of overlap there. But, you know, I think for them, they want to keep themselves alive because they've seen what the U.S. has done to some of the other senior commanders and the senior government leaders. And so I think, you know, when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the needs for self-preservation is pretty high up on that chart. So, you know, I think that's really just kind of basic human instincts that are coming into play in this negotiation.
And I wanted to ask you, get your comments on Lebanon. Do you find it an interesting situation where Iran is telling Israel to stop fighting in Lebanon against Hezbollah? But we have to consider that Hezbollah is a Iran proxy. So if they really wanted the fighting to stop, Iran can just ask Hezbollah. It doesn't need to ask Israel to stop fighting. Do you find that interesting?
You know, Don, I do, because I think that this is interesting. We will have to see what the final terms of the deal are going to be when this is all cut and dry. But, you know, I think Israel still wants to make sure that they neutralize Hezbollah as much as they can. And so whether or not that is going to be seen as an attack on Iran because they are an Iranian proxy, I think that remains to be seen.
Why do you think, you know, President Trump has talked about how Iran has taken advantage of the U.S. for 47 years, killed Americans, taken advantage of the Middle East for decades? Why do you think no other country has done anything meaningful really about it for 47 years other than President Trump?
I mean, I think for a lot of Americans, they have realized that, you know, it's really now or never. Because if Iran is not stopped, you know, if you don't cut off the head of the snake, if you will, they're going to just keep going and producing acts of terror all over the world. And so I think, you know, it's really President Trump's approach to this, that he's willing to take on members of his own party. Because again, we look back at, you know, there's been Republican senators that have voted for the Iran War Powers Act, and particularly as some of those senators have lost their primaries, they're more willing to go against President Trump. And, you know, I think in a lot of those cases it's because President Trump did not back them in their own re-election races. And so, you know, I think especially at a time such as this, when we're months away from the midterm election, we really see the interchange of politics and policy at play here more than we see at really few other times in the legislative calendar when it doesn't have that electoral pressure behind it.
Okay, a few more questions on this war. Do you think China has played a significant role? What are some of China's actions throughout this conflict with Iran?
I mean, I think China, of course, is the perfect example of keep your friends close but your enemies closer. At least based on what we saw publicly, a lot of the discourse between President Trump and Chinese leaders when he was over there just a few weeks ago was cordial. But then we also know from the reporting side, reporters were, at least I know some of my colleagues that were over there, they weren't able to go into some of the venues. I think there was issues with like Secret Service carrying their service weapons, which, was their duty to protect the president. And so I think that really goes to show that the Chinese love their kind of public pomp and circumstance, if you will, but there's still other things brewing underneath the surface that they tried to do their best to tamp down.
All right, let's move on from the Iran conflict. And I want to ask you about the primaries happening in New York today, the Democratic primaries. Do you think there has been a rise in Democratic Socialists in the Democratic Party? Have these candidates been gaining influence within the Democratic Party?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that you can look at. So first of all, Mayor Mamdani, who was, of course, much more of that socialist type of candidate who won last year, he's now using his newfound power as the mayor of New York to back radical progressives in a lot of these races. And, it'll be interesting to see tonight if they win or not. But what I also want to point out is that the DTRIP, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, they've endorsed a number of candidates in what they consider to be their red to blue targets. So these are kind of your more blue dog, if you will, or more moderate Democrats who they would like to see in the elections, in the general elections in November. And a lot of those candidates have lost to more progressive challengers. And so I think that really goes to show that the progressive ideology is permeating through the Democrat Party. I think even against the will or against the work of a lot of the longtime Democrat operatives and leaders. And then I think the other thing that you have to look at is also that these candidates are showing up not only in Democrat primaries, but that there's reporting that I've done on, for example, Dan Osborne, who is the so-called independent candidate running in Nebraska. He was recruited to run in 2024 when he lost against Deb Fischer, the current Republican senator. He was recruited by Daniel Maraf, who is somebody that is an advisor to Graham Plattner, has worked for types of people like Bernie Sanders, as well as just really other progressives. I think, Summer Lee, also of Pennsylvania. She was a progressive candidate who Maraf had worked for. So there's actually writings that I've reported on that Maraf has done that he wants to see Democratic Socialists take power, not only in the Democrat Party, but really across the board. And so in a lot of these cases, having them run as quote unquote independents, people think that's more moderate or more centrist candidates because that's what independent voters, I think, tend to be. But when you look at the beliefs of some of these candidates, you realize that's not the case and that they are really kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing and they are Democratic Socialists.
So why are voters voting for these Democratic Socialist candidates? Are there policies which, can be argued is very socialist, right? Is that what voters want?
I think that's what voters think they want. Because, for example, you look at Mayor Mamdani here, we were out talking with a couple of my colleagues here at Daily Mail. We were out interviewing voters, particularly in the 12th Congressional District, which has this toss-up race to replace Jerry Nadler. That's the one that's got Jack Schlossberg and George Conway in it, as well as the people that are probably going to win. It's between Alex Boris and Michael Lasher. Most of the people that we were looking at was supporting Lasher, and so he's kind of more the mainstream candidate. He was endorsed by Nadler, etc. But, the other thing that we were asking voters is what do they think about the job that Mamdani has done? And I think most of them were actually pretty happy. And a couple of them said that he didn't get their vote, but they haven't seen really negatives or they've actually seen positives of his mayoral time, time down at Gracie Mansion. And so I think that's interesting because you have these people that run on these super progressive ideas, but I think for a lot of voters that were kind of scared of that, they actually haven't seen a lot of that implemented. And so I think it's a case of maybe the bark is sharper than the bite, where they want to go out and do all these radical things, and when they get into office, they realize they can't actually do lots of them, but they still have that Democrat Socialist brand, which is attractive, particularly to younger voters.
How do you think this Democratic Socialist brand is going to do in the general election?
I mean, I think it's not going to fare very well. I think it may fare well in some of the bluer areas. But again, if we talk about some of those bluer areas, they are nominating candidates that the Democrat power players, at least in D.C., think can't win general elections. So, it'll be a surprise, I think, both to Republicans and Democrats alike if these candidates end up winning in the general election. But I also think that bodes well for Republicans, particularly in those swing seats, that it's going to be a lot easier for them to message against those candidates. We saw candidates being pinned to Mamdani. I'd say probably just about this time last year before he even got elected, that they were saying, oh, these people share consultants or these people are Mamdani light. And I think that's messaging that outside of really progressive areas isn't going to fare very well with regular everyday Americans.
All right, let me just get one more quick comment from you on what's happening in the UK. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, resigning. So any comments you have on that? What do you see for the future of the Labour Party in the UK?
Yeah, I think it's been contentious between both Labour and Conservatives. I also think, Conservatives have had at least two leaders that have not served a very long time. So I wonder if that's just kind of the attitude within Parliament, right? Because that's how, the leaders in the UK are chosen. Unlike in the U.S. where it's a national vote, these people are all MPs, they're elected members of Parliament, and then they kind of choose amongst themselves. At least from what I'm seeing, the most likely successor right now is Andy Burnham, who is actually not an MP right now. So he's looking to win in a by-election, a special election, to get back into Parliament, to potentially then be the PM, the Prime Minister. And then, you've also got people like Wes Streeting, who was in Starmer's cabinet and basically denounced him. So, to him, and I think to voters that may be associating him with Starmer, that's going to be a lot of baggage that he's going to bring into that PM fight. So that's definitely one that we'll be looking at across the pond in the next few weeks and months.
Do you think the Labour Party has any more chances potentially after Burnham, or is he the last one?
Well, again, you've got Burnham, but you've also got people like Streeting that are going to at least say they're different, even though he served in Starmer's cabinet. So we'll see if the people buy that, or if he just ends up fizzling out.
Okay, well, let's leave it there for today. Victoria, it's been great speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Don. Hope to be back with you soon.
All right, sounds good.